Hi, I'm Jon Kirkman, as ever. Just to remind people, I'm a journalist, music journalist at that, and a broadcaster based in England. Talking to you today about this. Now, all these things that I do, they're not sort of in-depth. They're just to give you an idea of what's available and what's on it. There are other people out there doing in-depth stuff. There's a few more in-depth things coming up, but for this, I'm just going to let you know that this is about. This is Toyah's second album, and it's called The Blue Meaning. Now, we did a thing about the first album, which was called Sheep Farming in Barnet. Now, if you're a Toyah fan, this is really an album that you should have in your collection. It's an expanded edition of the album, and I can remember at the time when this came out in 1980, this was a huge album. And I think the single, which was IER, came out on 12-inch and 7-inch, and that was #1 in the indie chart, and this became #1 in the indie chart and crossed over as well. It's a very, very dark album, quite experimental as well. So what you get is 2 CDs there. The second CD contains all the extra stuff, a lot of unreleased stuff on there. That's the first album, with some bonus tracks as well, like B-sides and things like that. There's some great stuff, which you listen to now and you think, wow, that's really experimental. Like the Helium song, Spacewalking, which, if I remember correctly, was one of the tracks on the B-side of the 12-inch single of IER. Now, IER, there's a great story about that. It kind of grew out of a concert where the National Front actually went to the gig, which happened a lot in those days. They used to go to gigs by Madness and the Specials, and they were recruiting people. And it was sad, really, because they were kind of recruiting young kids who didn't know any better. Hence the formation in the 70s of Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League. There was a lot of it going around then, and unfortunately, they infiltrated a Toyah gig and they were shouting at the back, "Seeker, Seeker." What happened was, at the encore, they basically got the audience to chant Nazi scum at these skinheads and National Front people at the back. And the song grew out of that. It was kind of like a jamming thing. But it was a very, very strong song. And it became, once Toyah became a little more commercially minded and actually moved from the clubs into the theatres, with the coming of the album Anthem and the hit singles I Want to Be Free and It's a Mystery, they used to use IER as the encore, and it's a very, very strong song, very, very strong song to end on. But it's a great song. As I said, I think it made #1 in the indie charts at the time. Here we go. Here, there's the 2 CDs, red and green, and the DVD there. Now also you get a pretty wonderful booklet which tells you the entire story of the album, and in the booklet here there's lots of outtakes from the cover shoot and lots of other things, because Toyah seemed to be everywhere at the time on the TV. Just there you go. And she loved mixing up the media. I mean, she really did. She used to do film, TV, concerts, music. She was also very, very heavily featured in the written media at the time, which were the magazines like The Face and The NME, of course, and the Melody Maker and stuff like that. And she was very, very proactive in all of that stuff, right the way across the media. And I think that is what basically caused the sort of fulcrum to switch, and she became very, very successful. This album was very, very experimental at the time, and a very dark album, I think, but it's certainly one of her best. And on the DVD, you get lots of video footage, like interviews, and you get current interviews with Toyah and some sessions of some of the songs from the album done acoustically. But you also get some vintage footage. For instance, there was a programme on the BBC on a Friday evening, and it went into Saturday morning. So the show was called Friday Evening, Saturday Morning. And it was a kind of, I suppose, a chat show, really. And it featured a lot of the arts, but it had a different presenter every week. For instance, one week there would be Tim Rice, the songwriter, and then another week it would be the former Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. One week it was Toyah. Now, I remember the guests on the Toyah show were Vivian Stanshall, formerly of the Bonzos, and I remember doing an interview with Toyah many years ago, and she said it was very difficult to interview on that show. You made it very hard for me. And Toyah she was no fool. She was a very, very sassy, very clever, very intelligent person, and she could really interview a lot of people. She was very, very good at that, and very good at getting into sort of people and talking to them, drawing them out in an interview. So she had a really good rapport with most of the people she interviewed, but sadly with Vivian Stanshall, not so much. And sadly, that's not on here. But what you do get is the fact that the show also featured musical guests, and that week that she was on, she was her own musical guest. So you've got Danced, and you've also got a really good version of the song The Mummies. Now, at the time, the original Toyah band had split. They split at the end of 1980, and Joel Bogan and Toyah had put the band together, but it was a kind of interim band. The next band would include people like Phil Spalding and Nigel Glockler. And that was the lineup really that made the Anthem album, which will be the next album in this series of ongoing Toyah releases. This album, though, if you're a Toyah fan, you will know all about this, and you would also love it, because it was a very, very popular album amongst Toyah fans at the time. The Blue Meaning, it's out again now in expanded format. You can see the order link running across the bottom of the screen here. It's another one from Cherry Red. The next album, I guess, which will be sometime in the next few months, will be Anthem. Now that is the one that's where Toyah kind of moved into the mainstream, and we're having hits like It's a Mystery, which was on the Four from Toyah EP, which came out between this album and the next studio album, which was Anthem. In between this album and Anthem, though, there was a live album, which was kind of the soundtrack to a TV documentary, and the live album was called Toyah, Toyah, Toyah. That was the last thing that the original band did. But there's a great interview on here where Toyah explains all that and how the band split, and yeah, it was a shame because I really liked the original band, but I really liked the new band as well. Phil Spalding, a friend of mine, he was the bass player in that particular band. He'd come from the Bernie Torme band. Bernie, of course, was, I think at the time, the guitarist in Ian Gillan, but before that he'd been signed to Jet and had his own band, released singles, etc. And Phil Spalding was the bass player in that band. And then, of course, from Toyah, Phil went on to play bass with people like Mike Oldfield and other great artists as well. He became a big session guy. I think he also was the bass player in a band called GTR, along with Steve Hackett. So it's amazing how a lot of these artists that were in the Toyah band went on to bigger and better things. But this is a really good album. You must have this if you're a Toyah fan. If you're not a Toyah fan, I don't know. I mean, I suppose you could tip your toe in the water, but it is a very experimental album, but a really fulfilling one. And it took me right back to when this album was released, and it was, I think, a #1 album. I might be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure it got to #1 in the indie charts, and certainly did quite well in the crossover charts, in the national album chart. But there you go. It's available now from Cherry Red and also your other online dealers. Toyah, The Blue Meaning. Great record.